She was sold to a stranger to survive the winter. No courtship. No choice. Just her father's trembling hand pressing hers into the rough, calloused grip of a man she had never met. A man who smelled like pine sap and cold iron, whose eyes gave away nothing. Evelyn Carter was 20 years old, and in the span of one afternoon, everything she thought her life would be was stripped away and replaced with a log cabin at the edge of the world. But here's what no one tells you about the wilderness. The cold outside is never the thing that breaks you. It's the cold inside, the kind that grows between two people who don't know how to reach each other, that does the real damage. What happens next will surprise you. Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. If it moves you, hit that like button and let's begin. The morning Evelyn Carter's life changed, the sky looked the way it always did in late October in the Montana Territory, pale and non-committal, the kind of gray that couldn't decide whether to storm or simply suffocate everything beneath it. She was standing at the window of her father's house when she heard the wagon pull up. The creak of the wheels on frozen mud, the jangle of harness. She didn't move to look. She already knew who it was because her father had told her 3 days ago, and she had spent those 3 days cycling through every emotion available to a 20-year-old woman who'd just been informed her future had been decided without her. Anger first, then something that felt like grief, then a cold, exhausted numbness that she wore now like a second skin. "Evelyn?" Her father's voice came from the doorway behind her. "He's here." "I heard. Come out and meet him properly." She didn't turn around. Her breath fogged the glass. Outside, a man climbed down from the wagon seat, tall, broad across the shoulders, moving with the kind of economy that men develop when every motion they make has to count for something. He wore a heavy coat that had seen hard winters. His boots were mud-caked, but his posture was straight. He didn't look around at the house like he was assessing it. He just stood there, reins looped over one wrist, and waited. "Evelyn." Her father's voice had shifted, softer now, with that particular quality it got when he was trying not to show how frightened he was. "Please," she turned. Thomas Carter was 53 years old and looked closer to 70. The illness that had taken his wife 8 years ago had left fingerprints on him that never quite faded. A permanent pallor, a slight tremor in his hands on cold mornings, a breathlessness when he pushed himself too hard. He was pushing himself now. She could see it in the tension around his mouth, the careful way he was holding himself upright. She loved him. That was the problem. That was the reason she was about to go outside and shake hands with a stranger named Silas Boone instead of slamming the bedroom door and refusing until spring. "All right," she said. She pulled her coat from the hook by the door. Her hands didn't shake. She was proud of that. The cold hit her face like a flat palm the moment she stepped onto the porch. Behind her, her father followed carefully, gripping the railing. The man by the wagon turned when he heard the door. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected from her father's description. Maybe 30, maybe a few years past it, with the kind of face that outdoor work ages in particular ways. Deep lines at the corners of his eyes, from squinting into sun and snow. A jaw that needed a razor's attention, dark hair gone rough at the edges where his hat had been. His eyes, when they found her face, were a quiet, steady gray. He didn't smile. He didn't do that thing men sometimes did when they were trying to make a good impression. The performance of charm, the too-wide grin. He just looked at her, direct and without apology, like a man who had decided some time ago that pretending was more effort than it was worth. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and careful, like he chose each word before he committed to it. "Mr. Boone." She kept her voice level, neutral. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. A beat of silence. Her father descended the porch steps slowly, his breath coming in visible puffs. "Silas," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for making the drive out." They shook. "Course, Thomas." The man, Silas, glanced at her father's face with something that wasn't quite concern, but was close to it. "How are you holding?" "Well enough." Her father smiled the smile he used when he was lying. "Well enough." Evelyn watched Silas Boone's expression. It didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A brief, quiet adjustment, like a man revising an assessment. He'd noticed the same things she noticed. The tremor, the breathlessness, the way her father was holding himself like a structure that had been shored up with whatever internal reinforcement he had left. She didn't know what to do with that, with the fact that this stranger had seen her father clearly in the space of 30 seconds. They sat inside for the conversation that mattered. Her father brought out coffee that was too weak because he'd been rationing the grounds, and Silas Boone sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his hands wrapped around the cup, and they talked about practical things. The arrangement had been her father's idea. That was the part that still burned in her chest when she let herself think about it. Not that Silas had come looking for a bride, because he hadn't. He'd apparently been getting on fine alone in his cabin up the valley for the better part of 3 years. It was Thomas Carter who had gone to him, hat in hand, sometime in early September when he'd looked at the season coming and looked at his own failing body and done the arithmetic. He couldn't winter alone anymore. He couldn't look after the property. And Evelyn who had grown up here, who knew no other life, who had never had the resources to leave even if she'd wanted to, needed someone to look after her when he no longer could. "It's not charity," her father said now, directing this at some point between the two of them. "Silas needs someone to manage the household side of things, the cooking, the preserving. He's been out there alone, and that's no kind of—" "Thomas," Silas set down his cup. "You don't have to sell it." Her father stopped. "Miss Carter." Silas looked at her directly. "No performance in it, just straightforward attention. I know this isn't what you'd have chosen. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or tell you it's for the best. What I'll tell you is that I'll be honest with you about everything I'm able to be honest about, and I won't make your life harder than it already is." Evelyn stared at him. She had prepared arguments. She had spent 3 days sharpening them. She'd been ready for promises, the big, handsome kind that men made when they wanted something and thought words were currency. She was not prepared for this. "That's it," she said. "That's it. You're not going to tell me the cabin is comfortable, or that the valley is beautiful in winter, or that this is actually a wonderful opportunity if I'd only think about it differently." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one, restrained before it could fully form. "The cabin is cold and it's a lot of work, and the valley in winter is brutal. I won't lie to you about any of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the angle, the thing underneath the honesty that was actually manipulation wearing a different coat. She'd seen that before, both men who led with plainness as a strategy, who made a performance out of having no performance. She couldn't find it. That bothered her more than if she had. "Fine," she said. Not agreement, not acceptance. Just the word, dropped onto the table like a stone, because she didn't have another one ready. But, The wedding happened 4 days later before the pass closed. It was not a ceremony Evelyn would have designed for herself. There was no dress. She wore her best wool skirt and her mother's brooch, which she pinned to her collar with the focused attention of someone performing a small act of defiance. The minister from the settlement at Cedar Fork came out in a wagon that was clearly in a hurry to get back before the weather turned, and he read from his book with the brisk efficiency of a man billing by the hour. Her father cried quietly, turned half away so she wouldn't see. She saw. Silas stood beside her at the front of her father's small sitting room and repeated the words when it was time to repeat them, in that same careful voice. Neither flat nor warm, just precise, like he meant every syllable and didn't feel the need to ornament them. When it was done, he didn't try to kiss her. He offered his hand instead, and she shook it, which felt absurd and also somehow correct. "We should move before noon," he said, "if we want to make the cabin before dark." "I know," she said. "I've lived in these mountains my whole life." He looked at her. "I know you have." She didn't have an answer for that, so she went to say goodbye to her father. The drive took 4 hours through country that got bleaker and more honest the further they went from Cedar Fork. Evelyn sat on the wagon seat beside Silas Boone and watched the familiar valley compress and reshape into something wilder. Trees thicker, the road narrowing to a track, the sky pressing down lower. She had been to this part of the valley a handful of times in her life. It had always felt like the edge of something. They didn't talk much. She wasn't in the mood for conversation, and he didn't seem to require it. Occasionally he'd point out something. A ridge where the snowpack looked unstable, a bend in the creek that flooded in spring. Practical information delivered without ceremony, like briefing a colleague on conditions they'd need to know. She filed it away. She was going to need to know things. The cabin appeared around a stand of heavy pines, and her first honest thought was, smaller than I expected. Her second thought, following immediately after, was, but solid. The logs were thick and well fitted, the chinking looked recent, the roof had been reinforced with extra timber along the ridge. Someone had spent real time and effort making sure the structure would hold against whatever the mountains threw at it. There was a barn set back from the cabin, also solid, with fresh repair work on one side wall. A woodpile that Evelyn, who understood winter, recognized as genuinely impressive. Split, stacked, covered. Enough for a long season if you were careful. Silas pulled the wagon up and set the brake and climbed down before she could make up her mind about whether she needed help. She didn't. She climbed down herself and stood in the frozen yard and looked at the cabin. "I'll take the horses in," he said. "Go inside if you want. Door's not locked." She hesitated for just a moment. Then she went. Bitten. The inside smelled like pine resin and wood smoke and something else. Leather, maybe, and the faintly mineral smell of a space that had been inhabited by one person for a long time. It was dim until her eyes adjusted, and then she could see it clearly. One main room that served as kitchen, sitting area, and workspace, with a stone fireplace at one end that was still throwing heat from a banked morning fire. A rough table, two chairs that didn't match, shelves along one wall with carefully organized supplies. A door at the back. She opened the back door. A bedroom. A real bed, not a cot. An actual bed frame with a rope base and a mattress that was, she leaned down to check, thick enough to matter. Quilts folded at the foot. A small window with oilskin tacked over it to keep out drafts. She came back out and stood in the main room and tried to do the math on where Silas Boone expected to sleep, because this single bedroom was obviously the only bedroom. He came in while she was still working it out, stamping mud and ice from his boots at the door. "You can put your things in the back," he said, moving toward the fireplace. He pulled off his coat and hung it on a hook near the door, then crouched to stoke the fire. "I'll take the main room." She stared at the back of his head. "The main room." "There's a pallet. I've slept on worse." "This is your house." "It's your house too now." He said it like it was a simple fact, not a declaration, not a performance of generosity, just a statement of the thing that was true. "You'll sleep better in the back, away from the fire noise. Logs pop all night." Evelyn stood in the center of her new home and tried to reorganize the map she'd drawn in her head over the last 4 days. The one where Silas Boone was the thing she was going to have to manage and endure and defend herself against. She was very good at defending herself. She'd been practicing for this. He hadn't given her anything to defend against. It was, she decided, deeply irritating. "I'll start supper," she said, because she had to say something, and cooking was the kind of work that didn't require a response. "Supplies are on the left shelves," he said, still looking at the fire. "Take whatever you need." She took stock of the shelves. Dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, canned tomatoes, 4 of them, which was a luxury this far out. Lard. A crock of honey, which surprised her. Dried herbs in cloth bundles, carefully labeled in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped, like a man who'd taught himself to write late and was still making peace with the alphabet. Pepper, coffee, a full tin of it. Better stocked than she'd expected. Better organized, too. She started a pot of beans with the salt pork and made cornbread in the cast-iron skillet she found hanging above the fireplace. She worked without asking where anything was, hunting through the space until she found what she needed, because asking felt like conceding something, and she wasn't ready to concede anything yet. He came in from outside twice more before supper, once to bring in more wood, once to do something with the horses she heard but couldn't see. Each time he moved through the space without disrupting her work, stepping around her without comment, as if they had already developed the choreography of living in proximity, and he didn't feel the need to point it out. When the food was ready, she set 2 bowls on the table and sat down. He came in, washed his hands at the basin by the door, and sat across from her. They ate. The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was just the silence of 2 people eating, which was something, at least. "Good," he said, at one point, nodding at the bowl. It's just beans, she said. I know. A beat. Still good. She ate her cornbread and didn't say anything else. She lay in the dark of the bedroom and listened to the cabin settle around her. The fire in the main room had been banked and was ticking quietly down, the logs shifting and contracting in the cold. Through the oilskin window she could hear wind, not a full storm, not yet, just the mountain breathing. She could not sleep. She was not afraid exactly. Fear was a specific thing, and what she felt wasn't that clean. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. Not the terror of falling, but the particular vertigo of not knowing. She had known what to expect from a hard man, from a man who felt that a wife arranged for his convenience was more possession than person. She knew how to navigate that, had been preparing to, had steeled herself for it, had packed her stubbornness and her sharp tongue and her refusal to be diminished like tools she intended to use. She hadn't packed anything for this. For a man who gave her the bedroom without being asked, who told her the truth about the winter without softening it, who ate her beans and called them good in a voice that wasn't trying to win anything. She didn't trust it. That was also honest. She did not trust it. Kindness could be a long game. Patience could be a different kind of control. She'd heard enough stories, from other women, from her mother before she died, from the particular education that women gave each other in whispers, to know that a man who opened with patience could sometimes simply be waiting. But she was also fair enough, in her private self, to acknowledge that she had no evidence for that reading except her own fear. And she was not a woman who let her fears make her decisions for her. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind and thought about her father in the house at Cedar Fork, probably doing the same thing right now. Lying awake, worrying, running his arithmetic over and over to make sure it still added up the way he'd calculated. She hoped it did. She was not certain, but she hoped. Eventually, sometime in the deep middle of the night, she slept. The cold came in earnest in the first week of November, and it came without any of the gentleness that people who'd never spent a winter in the high Montana valleys sometimes imagined when they thought about snow. It came like something angry, like something that had been saving itself up and was now done waiting. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. In the morning, the water in the basin by the door had frozen solid, and even the inside air bit at your hands and face until the fire got going properly. Evelyn learned quickly that the fire had to be her first priority, before anything else, before even putting on shoes, because a cabin without a good fire in that kind of cold became dangerous faster than anyone who hadn't experienced it could understand. Silas was always up before her. This bothered her in a way she chose not to examine too closely. By the time she came out of the bedroom in the gray early morning, the fire would already be burning hot, water would be heating, and he would typically be outside doing something, checking the horses, checking the woodpile, checking the structure of the barn for places where cold could get in. He moved through the morning the way he moved through everything, purposefully, without wasted motion, without complaint. "You don't have to be up before me," she told him one morning, about 2 weeks in. She was annoyed, though she would not have been able to say exactly why. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I wake up early, always have." "You could at least let the fire wait." "It's cold." "I know it's cold. I can start a fire." "I know you can." He set down his cup. "I'm not doing it because I think you can't. I'm doing it because I wake up first and it needs doing." She opened her mouth, closed it. He was looking at her with that direct, patient expression that she was coming to find deeply problematic, because it gave her nothing to push back against. "Fine," she said, and poured herself coffee, and that was the end of that. She began to learn the rhythms of the place, the cabin, the valley, the particular texture of days out here, where the nearest neighbor was 3 miles off, and the nearest settlement was a full day's drive in good weather. She had grown up in the mountains, so she wasn't soft. She could split kindling and preserve meat and navigate by landmarks and read the sky for weather the way her mother had taught her. But there was still a period of adjustment, of learning the specific logic of this cabin, this land, this man's habits. She discovered that Silas had a system for everything, and that the systems were good. His woodpile was organized by type: quick-burning pine for starting fires, slow-burning hardwood for keeping them. His tools were hung in a specific order that meant something to him, and he noticed immediately if anything was moved, though he didn't make a point of it, just quietly returned things to their place. His food stores were inventoried in a small notebook on the shelf, updated every few days. "You track all of this?" she asked one afternoon, paging through the notebook. "Have to," he said, from where he was at the workbench, repairing a harness strap. "Easy to think you've got more than you do. Get to February thinking you're fine and find out you're not." She looked at the neat columns, the dates and quantities, the careful, cramped handwriting. "What happens if you're not fine?" He didn't look up from the harness. "Depends on how not fine. If it's just uncomfortable, you endure. If it's genuinely short," he paused, "you go see what the neighbors have." "The Hendersons? They're 3 miles. They've helped me before. I've helped them." He pulled the strap tight, testing the repair. "That's how it works out here." She already knew that. She'd grown up in a version of this community. But hearing him say it so plainly, without any sentiment attached, just the simple statement of mutual dependence, reordered something in her understanding of him. He didn't think of this as charity. He thought of it as weather. You didn't feel shame about the weather. Tumak. The Hendersons were Ruth and Carl, somewhere in their mid-40s, with a daughter of 16 named Meg, who looked at Evelyn with the slightly desperate hunger of someone who had been starved of female company. Ruth Henderson was a woman who had spent so many years in hard country that she had the unshowy competence of someone for whom difficulty was simply the baseline condition of life. She shook Evelyn's hand the first time they met and said, "Good. We needed another woman in this end of the valley." And Evelyn had liked her immediately. Carl Henderson was quieter than his wife, a man of modest words who gave the impression of depth without performing it. He and Silas had an easy shorthand that came from years of neighboring. They could communicate a lot in few sentences, mostly about practical things, the kind of language that develops between people who've relied on each other in genuine emergencies. There was also a family further up the valley, the Praters, with their 3 young children and their constant endearing chaos, and an old man everyone called Dutch, who lived alone in a cabin that had seen better decades and refused all suggestions that he might want to reconsider that arrangement. Evelyn had thought she was going to the edge of the world. She found, instead, that she was at the edge of a small world. That was different. The first real crisis came in the 3rd week of November, when the temperature dropped below anything Evelyn had experienced, and the Prater family's youngest came down with a fever that wouldn't break. She found out because Ruth Henderson arrived at their door in the early afternoon, her horse blowing hard, her face tight. "May Prater's asking for help," Ruth said. "Little James, he's bad." Silas was already putting on his coat before Ruth finished the sentence. He looked at Evelyn. "You don't have to come," he said. "I'm coming," she said, and went for her coat. The Prater cabin was a mile and a half north, and by the time they arrived, the sky had taken on the yellow-gray color that Evelyn had learned to read as more weather coming. Inside, the cabin was hot with the fever heat of a sick child and the anxiety of parents who hadn't slept. Anna Prater, who was 25 and currently looked 40, was sitting by the bed where her 3-year-old lay flushed and breathing fast. Evelyn had some experience with sick children. Not extensive, but some. She'd helped her father through illnesses, had been around enough neighborhood situations to have picked up the basics. She pushed in past the general worry of the room and put her hand on the boy's forehead and felt the particular burning that lived in the range between bad and dangerous. "How long?" she asked Anna. "Since last night." Anna's voice was stripped of everything except the bare fact. "He won't drink. He has to drink, even if he fights it." Evelyn looked at what was in the room. A kettle, herbs she didn't recognize, a look of helplessness that she understood completely because she felt it too. "Have you got willow bark?" I don't know. Maybe." "I have some," Ruth said from behind her. They worked. That was the simplest way to put it. Evelyn and Ruth worked, and Anna Prater sat with her son and held his hand and talked to him quietly, in a voice that cracked sometimes. And Silas and Carl took the other 2 children outside to give them something to do, and to reduce the noise level in the cabin. The willow bark tea took time. Getting the boy to swallow it took patience and stubbornness, and the kind of quiet insistence that a frightened child will eventually give way to, if only because he doesn't have the energy to keep fighting. By evening, the fever had dropped enough to be less frightening. Not gone, but less frightening. "We should stay," Evelyn said to Silas when they stood together in the Prater yard in the blue cold of early evening. Tonight, at least. He looked at her, then at the sky, where the yellow-gray had deepened to a purple that meant snow before morning. The horses. Can they stay in the Prater's barn? It's small. He thought about it. Yeah, they can manage. They stayed. Evelyn sat with Anna Prater through most of the night while the men took shifts keeping both fires going and both wood supplies fed. She didn't know Anna well, had met her twice before in the valley, but by 3 a.m. she knew her considerably better, because a long night in a warm room with a sick child and enough fear to strip away politeness has a way of making people tell each other things. Anna told her about coming out from Ohio 5 years ago, full of ideas about what frontier life would be like, and finding out very quickly that ideas and reality did not share the same zip code. She told her about the miscarriage the winter before James was born, and the way Carl had sat on the floor of the cabin and held her and not tried to say anything, which was the right thing to do, and she had never forgotten it. She told her, toward the early hours of the morning, with a sideways look that had something knowing in it, that Silas Boone had helped them twice before, once with roof repairs after a bad storm, once with food when their stores ran short, and had refused any payment or trade for either. Didn't make a thing of it, Anna said. Just did it and went home. Evelyn filed that away. They got home the next morning in the thin gray light after a snowfall that had added 6 inches to what was already on the ground. Silas drove the wagon and Evelyn sat beside him, and the valley was quiet the way it only is after new snow. The sound deadened, everything simplified to white and dark wood and the pale sky. Thank you, she said. She hadn't planned to say it, it just came out. He glanced at her. For what? Last night, staying. He looked back at the track ahead. Of course. It wasn't... She started, then stopped. Tried again. You didn't have to. They needed help. He said it in the same tone he'd have used to report on the weather. That's what you do. She looked at the side of his face, the clean line of his jaw, the way he was squinting slightly against the glare off the snow, which made the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen. My father told me you were a good man, she said. It came out more plainly than she intended, without the armor she usually put on things. He was quiet for a moment. Your father's kind. He's not, actually. He's practical. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. She paused. That's where I get it from. A beat. That almost smile again, barely there, pulling at one corner of his mouth and then going. I know, he said. She turned to look at the snow-covered valley ahead and said nothing else, because there wasn't anything else to say right then, and sometimes silence was the right container for the thing you didn't have words for yet. December brought more cold, more snow, and the particular quality of darkness that comes from short days in mountain country, a darkness that arrives in the mid-afternoon and settles in like a tenant who knows they're not leaving anytime soon. Evelyn adjusted. She was surprised to find she adjusted faster than she'd expected. She was good at work, and there was always work. Cooking, preserving, mending, managing supplies, making the cabin more efficient than it had been when it was run by a man alone who didn't always notice the small things that accumulated into large problems. She reorganized the food stores with Anna Prater's help on a day when the weather allowed for visiting. She found a gap in the cabin chinking near the bedroom window and fixed it with a mixture she learned from Ruth Henderson. She made soap, a project that took a full day and smelled terrible, and produced something actually useful, which satisfied her in a way she wouldn't have predicted. Silas watched all of this without comment, except occasionally to ask if she needed something specific or to note where he'd put things that she might be looking for. He was not a man who praised exactly, but he noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way his eyes tracked the changes she made, not with resistance, not with the particular male possessiveness about space that she'd braced for, but with a kind of quiet observation, like a man who was updating his mental map. He brought her things sometimes, a handful of dried cranberries he'd come across somewhere, placed on the table without comment. A rabbit fur he'd cured, set beside her sewing kit because her hands were chapped, and he'd seen her wince when the cold got into the cracks. Once, memorably, a small glass jar of something she didn't recognize. What is this? She asked, holding it up. Calendula salve. He didn't elaborate. For your hands. She opened the jar. smelled faintly of something herby and faintly of beeswax. She looked at him. "Did you make this?" "Ruth Henderson did. I asked her to." He was already moving toward the door to go do something outside. "She said you'd know what to do with it." He was gone before she could formulate a response. She used it on her hands that night, sitting by the fire, and found herself in the difficult position of being grateful to a man she wasn't yet sure what to do with. The thing about gratitude she had found was that it created a crack in whatever wall you'd built. Not a collapse, just a crack, enough to let light through, which was its own complication. She started paying attention differently. She noticed that Silas checked on Dutch, the old man up the valley, roughly once a week, loading a portion of their supplies into the saddlebags without discussion and riding out in the cold. She noticed because she asked one evening where he was going and he said, "Dutch." And she said, "Is he all right?" And Silas said, "He's fine, just old and stubborn," in a voice that was fond in its exasperation. She filed that too. She noticed that he knew the names of the Henderson children, all 4 of them, though 2 were nearly grown and Meg was 16. And that when Meg Henderson came over one afternoon to help with a mending project Evelyn had started, Silas spoke to her without the careful remove that some grown men used with teenage girls, like they might break or embarrass everyone. He just talked to her like a regular person. Meg visibly appreciated this. Evelyn did too, quietly. She noticed that he was hard on himself in ways he wasn't hard on anyone else. That if something didn't work, a repair that failed, a hunting day that came back empty, he processed it alone and quickly and moved on, without the indulgence of self-pity or the performance of frustration. He seemed to feel that his job was to solve problems, not to have feelings about them. And while she recognized this as its own kind of limitation, she also recognized it as discipline, which she respected even when she found it a little inhuman. Once, only once, in those early weeks, she caught a glimpse of something different. She'd come in from outside one afternoon to find him at the workbench, not working, just sitting. His hands were on the surface of the wood, and he was looking at something in the middle distance that was not any physical object in the room. His expression was the particular expression of a person living briefly in a thought they hadn't invited. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her and looked up, and the expression was gone, replaced by the usual careful neutrality. But she'd seen it, just for a second. "Sorry," she said, though she didn't know what she was apologizing for. "Nothing." He looked back at his hands. "Cold out?" "Getting worse." She came in and hung her coat. "I think we're due for a storm by morning." "Yeah." He stood and went back to whatever he'd been working on. She went to start supper. She didn't ask what he'd been thinking about. It wasn't the moment for that, and she wasn't sure she was owed it yet. But she tucked the image away, the unguarded face, the distant eyes, and thought about it later, when she was alone in the dark of the bedroom with the wind picking up outside. He was a person. She had known this in the abstract, but she was starting to know it in the specific, which was different. A man with something missing in him, or something stored away so carefully it took a moment of stillness to surface. She didn't know what it was. Maybe she'd find out. Maybe she wouldn't. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm beginning, the first real blow of the deep winter, and thought that she was, against her better intentions, becoming curious about the person she'd agreed to share a life with. Curious, she decided, was okay. Curious didn't require anything. It was just paying attention. She could manage that. When December was nearly half gone, Evelyn made the drive with Silas to Cedar Fork to check on her father. She'd been wanting to go sooner. The weather had prevented it. 2 storms in succession that made the track impassable, followed by a brief break, followed by temperatures cold enough that going out unnecessarily was the kind of risk you thought twice about. By the time they made it, she'd been 3 weeks without seeing Thomas Carter, which was the longest she'd gone in her life. She found him in his chair by the fire, thinner than she'd left him and more tired, but present and clear-eyed and irritable in the way he always was when he'd been worrying and didn't want to admit it. "You look terrible," she said, which was how she said she'd missed him. "Thank you, Evelyn." He looked past her at Silas, who'd come in behind her with a saddlebag over one shoulder. "You brought supplies." "Few things," Silas said, setting the bag down. "Coffee and some of the salt pork, and Ruth Henderson sent a jar of her pickled beets." Her father looked at the saddlebag, then at Silas. You didn't need to do that. Ruth wanted to. You told Ruth to. A pause. Silas said nothing. Her father nodded, the nod of a man who has received something he didn't ask for and isn't sure how to accept it gracefully. Well, he said, thank you. Evelyn watched this exchange from the edge of the room. She realized, watching Silas the way she watched weather, looking for patterns, trying to understand the system. He had brought supplies for her father. He had arranged it through Ruth Henderson so her father wouldn't feel like he was being given charity directly from his son-in-law, which would have been harder to swallow. He had thought about her father's pride and worked around it without being asked. She turned and went to make tea and stood in her father's kitchen with her hands around the kettle and thought about that for a quiet moment. The map she'd drawn of Silas Boone was wrong. She'd drawn it in 3 days, in fear and anger, and it was wrong. She was going to have to draw a new one. She didn't know yet what it would look like, but she was beginning to gather the details she'd need. Outside, through the small window above the wash basin, she could see the 2 men in the yard, her father and her husband, talking in the particular way of men who were going to talk about practical things and let the emotional things live underneath. The gray sky pressed down on both of them. The valley lay quiet in all directions. She watched until the kettle began to steam, and then she went to make tea and she carried it back to the sitting room. And she sat down with her father and her husband in the small warm space of the afternoon, and she was not happy yet. Happiness was too simple a word for what was happening, but she was something, paying attention, which, for now, was enough. The second month of winter had a different quality than the first. The first month had been shock. The cold, the isolation, the constant work of adjusting to a life that fit nothing she had imagined for herself. The second month was something harder to name. Not adjustment exactly. More like the slow, uncomfortable process of seeing clearly a place you'd been looking at through fog. Evelyn was seeing Silas Boone more clearly. She wasn't sure yet whether that made things easier or more complicated. What she knew for certain by mid-December was that he was not performing. That had been her central suspicion, that the patience and the small kindnesses were a front, a strategy, something that would eventually reveal its cost. She'd been waiting for the moment when the mask slipped and she saw what was underneath. But the weeks kept passing and the mask never slipped because there was no mask. What she was looking at was just the man. That realization settled into her like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples kept going long after the initial impact. It did not make her trust him completely. She was not built for complete trust quickly. Her mother had taught her, without meaning to, that people showed you different faces depending on what they needed from you, and that the face you saw in the easy times was not always the one you'd see when things got hard. She needed to see him in the hard times, the real hard times, not the manageable difficulties they'd navigated so far. December gave her that. It gave her more than she asked for. The Prater baby got sick again. A different sickness this time, a chest thing that settled in deep and wouldn't shake loose. Evelyn found out on a Tuesday when Meg Henderson rode over in the early afternoon with her horse breathing hard and her face carrying the news before she said it. This time it was more serious than the fever in November. Anna Prater had been awake 3 nights running, and the baby's breathing had a sound to it that frightened everyone who heard it. Silas was out checking the fence line when Meg arrived. Evelyn didn't wait for him. She told Meg to rest the horse and warm up, packed what she could from the medicine shelf, the willow bark, the camphor salve Ruth Henderson had brought over, a cloth for steam treatment that she'd read about in the almanac her mother had kept. And when Silas came in 20 minutes later, she was already in her coat. James Prater, she said, worse. He looked at her, looked at the pack in her hands. I'll saddle the horses. Meg's horse needs rest. We take the wagon. Wagon's slower. I know, but I've got supplies and I'm not leaving them. He held her gaze for a second, then nodded. Give me 10 minutes. They made it to the Prater cabin in just over an hour, through cold that had teeth in it. The sky was that particular flat white that meant serious weather was thinking about arriving, and the track was hard and uneven under the wagon wheels. Evelyn sat with the pack on her lap and went through in her head what she knew about chest sickness in young children, which was not as much as she would have liked. Inside, the cabin was hot and anxious. Anna Prater looked like a woman being quietly consumed from the inside. Eyes hollow, hands moving, That specific kind of terrified stillness that comes from being afraid to move too fast because you don't want to see whether things are as bad as you think. Carl was there, and he looked the same, just quieter about it. The baby's breathing was bad. Not the worst Evelyn had ever heard, but bad enough. She set up the steam treatment and sat with James for 2 hours, monitoring, adjusting, talking to Anna in a low voice about what she was doing and why, because she'd found the previous time that Anna did better when she understood the reasoning rather than just being told what to do. Carl and Silas disappeared outside at some point and came back smelling of cold and wood smoke, and the fire was suddenly burning better, and there was more wood stacked by the door than there had been before. "The stack on the east side was getting low," Silas said when she glanced at him. "You split wood." Carl's got a bad shoulder. His swing's off. He sat down at the table with his coffee and looked at the fire like the conversation was finished, because to him it was. By evening, the baby's breathing had eased. Not all the way, but enough. Enough that Anna Prater put her face in her hands and cried the way you cry when the worst fear loosens its grip slightly. Not relief exactly, more like the body finally allowing itself to feel the weight it's been holding. Evelyn sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Sometimes you just had to let someone cry. Later, when the Prater children were settled and Carl had finally fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, Evelyn and Silas stood outside in the frozen yard for a few minutes. Her breath made clouds. The sky had gone fully dark, and the stars were sharp and hard the way they only get in serious cold. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked. She wasn't sure what she meant exactly. The fear, the helplessness, the way illness in this country felt so much larger than it did in a place with doctors and pharmacies and other people close by. Silas was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "You just get better at functioning while you're scared." She looked at the side of his face. "Is that what you do?" "Most of the time. A beat. Doesn't always work." She didn't push it, but she thought about it on the drive home in the dark, in the cold, with the horses picking their careful way along the track and the valley silent around them. Silas Boone admitting that functioning while scared didn't always work was more honesty than she'd expected, more than most people offered without being cornered into it. She was revising her map again. The new version had more detail in it. The week before Christmas, she found out, not from Silas, because Silas would not have told her, that he had been making a regular circuit of the valley's struggling households since November. Not just Dutch, not just the Praters. There were 2 other families on the far end of the valley that she'd barely met, both of them going through bad seasons. A husband down with a broken leg that had healed wrong, a widow with 4 children, and a store of supplies that hadn't been adequate going in. Silas had been checking on both of them, bringing what he could spare, helping with the physical work that the situations required. She found out because Ruth Henderson mentioned it in passing, assuming Evelyn already knew, the way you assume a wife knows what her husband does with his days. Evelyn was quiet for a moment after Ruth said it. "How long has he been doing that?" she asked. Ruth looked at her. Understanding moved across her face. "Oh," she said quietly. "Honey, since October, I think, before you came." Evelyn drove home that afternoon thinking about a man who did things without announcing them, who helped without keeping score, who had apparently been the unofficial safety net for a scattered valley community for years, in a quiet and consistent way that left no fingerprints of pride or expectation. She didn't say anything to him when she got home. She put away the horse, came inside, started supper. He was at the workbench doing something with a piece of leather and a needle, working by the firelight with the patience of a man who didn't need to rush. "Ruth told me," she said after a while. He didn't look up. "Told you what?" "About the Abbotts, and Margaret Finch and her kids." A pause. He kept his eyes on his work. "Ruth talks. Ruth assumed I knew." She stirred the pot. "She was surprised I didn't." He didn't say anything. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked up then. His expression was one she'd started to recognize, the one he wore when he was deciding how honest to be, which he always resolved in favor of honesty, but the deciding took a second. "Because it wasn't about you," he said. "It's just what I do." "I live here," she said. "Things you do, I should know about." "You're right." He said it without defensiveness, without the edge that men sometimes put on agreement when they were conceding something they didn't want to concede. I'm not used to accounting to anyone. I know. She paused. I'm not asking you to account. I'm asking you to tell me. He held her gaze. All right, she said. She went back to the pot. He went back to his leather work. But the room felt different after that. Not warmer exactly, but more inhabited. Like two people had just moved slightly closer to being in the same place rather than adjacent places that happened to share a roof. Christmas was quiet. She hadn't expected much and he hadn't promised much, so there was no gap between expectation and reality to fall into. She cooked a better meal than usual. A piece of venison he'd been saving, potatoes from the root cellar, dried apple preserves she'd put up in the fall. He produced, from somewhere she hadn't known about, a small packet of good tea and a book he'd had wrapped in cloth in the bottom of his trunk. I don't know if you like novels, he said, setting it on the table beside her plate. His voice had the particular quality of a person who has done something they're not sure will land right. She picked it up. It was a collection of stories. She didn't recognize the author. And it was worn at the spine, which meant he'd read it himself. She looked at it for a moment. You read fiction? She said. In the evenings, when there's nothing else. A beat. I thought you might want something. She set it down carefully and looked at him across the table. He was watching her with that restrained expression, the one that gave nothing away about whether he cared how she received it. Thank you, Silas, she said. Something shifted slightly in his face, not relief exactly, more like a small relaxation of something that had been held taut. You're welcome, he said, and picked up his fork, and that was the whole of Christmas between them. She read 3 of the stories that night before the fire, and she thought about the fact that the book's spine was worn from his own reading, and she thought that you could tell a lot about a person by which pages they'd lingered on long enough to crease. January arrived with the violence that felt personal. 2 storms in the first week, one on top of the other before the valley had time to dig out from the first, and then a cold snap that drove the temperature to places that turned the air dangerous. The firewood consumption doubled. The horses needed more feed. Every task took longer because cold does that. It adds friction to everything, turns simple chores into ordeals, makes the gap between getting it done and not getting it done wider and more consequential. Silas had predicted this. In November, he talked about the deep winter stretch in the tone of a man who'd survived it multiple times and wanted to make sure she understood what was coming. She'd listened, but not fully believed, because you can hear about a thing and still not know it in your body until it happens. Now she knew it in her body. She was not fragile. She needed it said, even just to herself. She was not fragile, and she was not struggling in the way that would have given her father cause to regret his decision. But the January cold pressed on you in a way that was cumulative. Days when the wind didn't stop, nights when the temperature made the logs pop and crack like gunshots, mornings when it took genuine effort of will to get out from under the quilts and do the thing that needed doing. What she noticed about Silas in January was the steadiness. It was not that he was unaffected. She could see, in the set of his shoulders on the worst mornings, that he felt it, that the cold and the relentlessness and the grind of it registered on him, but it didn't knock him off course. He got up. He did the thing. He didn't complain about it, which was not because he was suppressing something, but because complaining about weather was, in his view, roughly equivalent to complaining that the sky was blue. It didn't change anything, and it wasted energy you needed. She started to match him in this, not consciously at first. It was more like she found herself borrowing his steadiness on the mornings she couldn't find her own, the way you borrow a coat when you've forgotten yours. It helped. She didn't tell him it helped. She suspected he knew anyway, the way he seemed to know most things in the cabin, quietly and without making a point of it. In the middle of January, they had their first real argument. It was about her father. Silas had made another supply run to Cedar Fork without telling her he was going. She'd been over at the Hendersons helping Ruth with a quilt project that Ruth had been using as an excuse to gather the Valley women together for company, which was good thinking on Ruth's part. She came home to find Silas back with the horses already settled, and she asked how her father was, because it took her a second to realize that he'd been gone and come back, and then she was annoyed. You went to see him without me, she said. Weather looked like it was going to turn. I wanted to get there and back before it did. I could have come. It was faster alone. I don't care about faster. Her voice had an edge to it that had been building up for a few days without anywhere to go. He's my father. You don't get to decide when I see him. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't deciding when you see him. I was going because the weather was closing and someone needed to check on him. Then you tell me first. You let me make the call. And if you'd said you wanted to come and the weather turned while we were on the road, you'd have been stuck out there. His voice was not raised. This was somehow more frustrating than if he'd matched her volume. I made a judgment call. It wasn't your call to make. Maybe not. He held her gaze. But I made it, and your father's fine, and the storm hit 2 hours after I got back. She stood in the center of the cabin with her coat still on and the frustration in her chest looking for somewhere to put itself. And she was honest enough to recognize that part of what she was angry about was not the decision he'd made, but the fact that he'd been right. That he'd looked at the sky and read it correctly and done the thing that needed doing before the window closed. Tell me next time, she said. Quieter. The edge mostly gone. I will, he said. And she believed him because he'd kept every other thing he'd said he'd do. She took off her coat and hung it up and went to check on the fire. And he went back to what he'd been doing, and neither of them spoke about it again. But something had happened in the room that hadn't happened before. They'd fought, and neither of them had run from it, and they'd come back to something that functioned when it was over. That was not nothing. Her father, Silas told her when she finally asked, was holding on, thinner than before. The cold was hard on him. But he was eating the things Ruth Henderson had sent, and he'd had a neighbor, a woman named Clara from the east end of Cedar Fork, stopping in every few days. He'd looked tired but clear-eyed. He'd asked about Evelyn, and Silas had said she was well and managing, and her father had looked at him for a long moment and said, "She's more than managing, I expect." And Silas had said, "Yeah, she is." Evelyn processed that, the image of the two of them, her father and her husband, talking about her in a cold sitting room in Cedar Fork, and felt something that was too complicated to name easily. Pride and grief and gratitude braided together, with something warmer underneath that she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. February came. The valley settled into the particular exhaustion of a winter that had been going on long enough that everyone had stopped being surprised by it and was simply enduring. Tempers in the community were shorter. She heard about a dispute between Carl Henderson and one of the valley men on the far end over a property line that had been dormant for 3 years and suddenly mattered enormously, which Ruth said was what February did to people. Put you in the same tight space long enough, and every small irritant became a genuine grievance. In the cabin, the opposite happened. The longer they were in the same tight space, the more Evelyn and Silas seemed to find the rhythm of it. They'd learned each other's patterns, who needed quiet in the morning and who could talk from the moment of waking, who ran cold and needed the fire built higher and who was fine with it. Lower, who lost patience with inefficiency and who could sit with a problem for an hour before moving to solve it. They'd stopped explaining themselves about these things. It happened naturally, the way it happens when you pay enough attention to another person over enough time that the information becomes automatic. She was paying attention. She knew that. She'd stopped trying to pretend she wasn't. One evening in late February, when the temperature outside was low enough to make the windows creak, she came in from the barn. She'd taken over the evening horse check sometime in January, partly because it needed doing, and partly because she'd found she liked horses more than she'd expected, and found Silas at the table with the letter in his hands. He looked up when she came in. There was something different about his face, not distress exactly, more like the face of a person holding news they haven't finished processing. "Letter came with the Henderson boy this afternoon," he said. "For you." She pulled off her gloves and crossed the room and took it. The handwriting on the outside was her father's. The cramped, careful script of a man who'd taught himself to write the same way Silas had, late and deliberately. She opened it. The letter was short. Her father's letters were always short because he considered wordiness a form of self-indulgence. He was all right, he said. He was getting through. He'd had a setback in January. She read this twice, the word setback, trying to understand what it meant in the specific. A few bad days, a fever that had frightened Clara enough to send for the doctor from the next town. But he was better now. He wanted her not to worry. He was proud of her. He'd made the right choice, he said, and he needed her to know that he knew it. She folded the letter and stood at the table and looked at the worn wood surface and breathed carefully. "He had a fever," she said. Her voice came out flat, which meant she was working to keep it level. "I know. Ruth told me when the letter came. She'd heard from Clara." She looked at him. "You knew before the letter." "This afternoon." He met her gaze. "I should have told you when you came in. I was thinking about how to." "How to what?" "Tell you without making it worse than it is." He paused. "He's all right, Evelyn. Clara says he's past it." She sat down in the chair across from him. Not because she felt faint, she didn't, but because the information needed somewhere to land and standing felt wrong. She put the letter on the table between them and looked at it. "He's alone," she said. "I know. He was sick and he was alone and I was 3 miles away because the weather—" "Stop." His voice was quiet, not harsh, just steady, the same steadiness that she'd been borrowing on the bad mornings. "You couldn't have changed it, and Clara was there. Clara is a neighbor. She's not family." He didn't say anything for a moment. She could feel him thinking, not calculating what to say, but actually thinking, which was different. "You want to go see him," he said. "The pass—" "I know the pass. There's a 3-day window coming. I've been watching the sky." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. "We go in 2 days. Stay a night. Come back. The window will hold if we're not slow." She looked at him. "You were already planning this." He held her gaze. "I was thinking about it before the letter. Before she'd even known about the fever. He'd been looking at the sky and thinking about her father and the window and the weather and planning a way through it." She sat with that for a moment. She sat with the fact that he'd been carrying this, the concern for her father, the logistics of getting there, without saying anything because he hadn't had all the pieces yet, and that when he did have them, he offered them without drama. "All right," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. 2 days? He nodded. That was all. He stood and went to bank the fire for the night, and she stayed at the table for another minute with her father's letter under her hand, and she thought about the word setback and the word proud and the sentence, "I've made the right choice, and I need you to know I know it." No. She thought her father was probably correct. She was not ready to say it out loud yet, but she was close enough to it that she could see it from where she was standing. Close enough that the distance between what she felt and what she was willing to admit was getting harder to maintain. They made it to Cedar Fork in the 3-day window Silas had predicted, and her father opened the door before they'd even tied the horses, which meant he'd been watching from the window, which meant he was more anxious than his letter had let on. He looked smaller than he had in December. That was Evelyn's first thought, and it hit her somewhere below the ribs. The specific grief of watching a parent diminish, the way it never becomes ordinary no matter how many times you see it. He was wrapped in 2 layers despite the fire burning well inside, and the hand he put on her shoulder when she embraced him had less strength in it than she remembered. "I'm fine," he said before she could say anything. "Don't look at me like that." "I'm not looking at you like anything. You're looking at me exactly like your mother used to when she thought I was being stupid about my health." He let her go and turned to Silas, and the 2 of them shook hands with the ease of men who'd done it enough times that it had its own rhythm. "You made good time." "Window's only 3 days," Silas said. "Didn't want to waste any of it." "Yes." Her father nodded and stood back and let them in, and Evelyn went straight to the kitchen to see what the state of things was. Because that was how she checked on her father, not by asking him questions he'd lie about, but by looking at whether he was eating and what condition the house was in, and whether Clara from next door had been keeping up with the firewood. The kitchen was not bad. Organized enough, supplied enough. Clara was clearly doing more than she'd admitted to in her reports. Evelyn made a mental note to send something back with them. A proper thank you, in the form of the pickled goods and the smoked meat that said more than words could. They stayed the night. Her father and Silas sat by the fire after supper and talked in the way they'd developed over the winter. Practical on the surface, something else underneath. She cleaned up in the kitchen and listened to the low register of their voices without catching the words, and it was the kind of sound that should have been ordinary and wasn't, because nothing about this year had been ordinary, and she was still adjusting to the fact that her life had pieces in it that fit together in ways she hadn't anticipated. Later, when her father had gone to bed, and she and Silas were both by the dying fire, she said, He's worse than the letter. Yeah. He knows it. Yeah. Silas turned his cup in his hands. He's not going to say so. No. She looked at the fire. He never does. He thinks if he says the thing, it becomes more real. Doesn't work that way. I know. He knows too, I think. He just can't help it. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need to check on him more often. We will, Silas said. No performance in it. Just the pronoun, adjusted without discussion from the singular to the plural. She noticed it, and he probably knew she noticed it, and neither of them made anything of it, which was the right call. She slept in her old room that night, in the bed she'd grown up in, and it felt smaller than she remembered, and not entirely like home anymore, which was a strange thing to realize. The cabin in the valley, with its 2 small bedroom and its fire that popped all night, and its workbench smelling of leather and pine. That was starting to occupy the space in her chest that home occupied. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. They drove back the second day, ahead of the weather. The sky was doing the thing it did before a serious storm, gathering itself, the clouds thickening from the west with a heaviness that had intention behind it. Silas watched it the whole drive back without saying anything, but she could read him well enough now to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Distance against speed against what the sky was telling him. They made it. The storm hit 4 hours after they pulled in, and it was the worst one yet. It started as wind, the kind that finds every gap in the chinking and makes the cabin walls talk, and then added snow, and then added more wind, and then seemed to decide that these 2 things weren't sufficient, and lowered the temperature by another 15 degrees overnight, as if making a point. By morning, the world outside was white and obliterated. The track to the road invisible, the tree line at the edge of the property barely visible through the driving snow. Evelyn stood at the window with her coffee and watched it, and felt, for the first time in the winter, something close to fear. Not for herself. She and Silas had enough wood, enough food, enough of everything that they could outlast this storm without serious difficulty. What she felt was the fear of the valley, the larger distributed fear that belonged to everyone out there in their separate cabins, and particularly to the ones who were already short on something. The Praters with their sick baby, Dutch up the hill alone, the Abbotts with the husband's bad legs still not healed right. The Hendersons are fine, Silas said from behind her. He'd read it on her. By now he could do that. Catch the shape of what she was thinking without her having to say it. Carl got his woodpile sorted last week. Ruth's got stores. The Praters. Better stocked than last month. I checked when I went up there for the harness. He came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth off him. James is better too. Anna said he'd finally stopped wheezing. Dutch. Dutch is the most stubborn man in Montana, and he's been surviving these winters since before either of us was born. He paused. He'll be fine. She let out a slow breath. I hate not being able to do anything. I know. His voice was even, without the particular quality that some people used when they were trying to talk you out of what you were feeling. He wasn't trying to talk her out of it. He was just acknowledging it, which was better. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of a world reduced to the cabin, the fire, the 2 of them. The horses needed tending twice daily, which meant going out into the storm in layers that still weren't quite enough, moving through drifts that reached Evelyn's knee by the second day. She and Silas split the barn work between them without discussion, the same way they'd split most of the cabin's labor over the winter. Not formally, not by assignment, just by who was ready when the thing needed doing. On the second day, the temperature inside the cabin dropped noticeably despite the fire, and after an hour of investigation, Silas found the problem. A section of chinking on the north wall had failed, probably worked loose by the wind, and was letting cold air pour through a gap the size of a man's fist. He fixed it from inside using the materials on the supply shelf, working in his coat because even inside the cabin had gotten cold enough to see his breath. Evelyn held the lamp and passed him materials and didn't get in the way of his hands, and they worked in close proximity without awkwardness, which 3 months ago would not have been possible. There, he said, when the gap was sealed. He pressed the patching flat and held it for a moment. His hands were red from the cold. Good. She put the lamp down. Your hands. He looked at them. Fine. They're not fine, they're half frozen. She crossed to the shelf and found the calendula salve, the one Ruth Henderson had made that he'd brought home for her hands, and came back and held it out. He looked at the jar. Something crossed his face, a small, brief thing she almost missed. Then he took it. "Thank you," he said. She went to stoke the fire. "You're welcome." It was a small moment, the kind that doesn't announce itself as significant. But she thought about it that evening, sitting across from him with the book he'd given her at Christmas open in her lap and not reading it, because she was thinking instead about the jar of salve and what it had cost him to take it. He was a man who took care of things, who didn't easily become the thing being taken care of. She understood that dynamic because she had her own version of it, and she recognized the particular difficulty of receiving something when your whole orientation was toward giving. He was not a simple man. She'd thought in the beginning that plainness was simplicity. She understood now that they weren't the same thing. A man could be plain and still have depth to him, could be uncomplicated in his speech and deeply complicated in the interior that speech barely touched. She was curious about that interior, more than she'd been about anything in a long time. On the third day of the storm, he told her something she hadn't known. It came out of a conversation that started about something else entirely, about the book she'd been reading, of all things, a story in it about a man returning to a place he'd left behind. "My wife didn't like winter," he said. She went very still. She'd known, in a general way, that there had been a wife. Ruth Henderson had mentioned it once, briefly, in the way you mention something everyone already knows and aren't quite sure whether to bring up. She'd never asked Silas about it because it hadn't seemed like territory she was owed. "What happened?" she said. She kept her voice careful, not gentle in the way that makes people feel handled, just careful. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Fever, the winter before last." He looked at his hands. "Fast. She was sick 4 days and then she wasn't there anymore." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. She meant it in the plain, unsentimental way he dealt with things. Not sorry as performance, just sorry as fact. He nodded. Her name was Catherine. A pause. She hated the winter. She'd have liked Texas or somewhere with real summers. "I kept thinking we'd go someday." He stopped. The fire ticked. "Didn't go." The weight of those 2 words sat in the room. Didn't go. Not a story about a tragedy, exactly. A story about time running out before the thing you meant to do. Those were different kinds of grief, and she knew them both. "Is that why you stayed out here alone?" she asked. "After. Partly." He looked up. "Partly I just didn't know what else to do. This is the life I know." She held that. And then, because it seemed like the right thing, she offered something back. Not to balance a transaction. She wasn't doing it for that reason. She did it because he'd trusted her with something real, and that deserved something real in return. "I was engaged," she said. "Before, 2 years ago. A man in Cedar Fork, Martin Cole. We'd been... Well, I thought we were serious." She looked at the fire. "He left in the spring, went to Oregon with his brother's family. He said he wrote a letter. I don't know whether he did or not." Silas said nothing. He was listening the way he did, fully, without filling the space. "My father never said I told you so," she said. Even though he'd had reservations about Martin from the beginning, he just let me be sad about it and didn't make it into a lesson. She paused. "I think that's when I started understanding him better. What kind of man he actually was." "Good man," Silas said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I think you two are more alike than either of you would admit." The ghost of something crossed his face. Not the almost smile. Something quieter than that. "Maybe," he said. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. The wind dropped first, and then the snow thinned, and by mid-morning there was pale light coming through the oilskin window and the particular quality of silence that follows a major storm. The sound of a world that has been through something and is now resting. Silas went out to assess the damage before she'd finished her coffee. She heard him on the roof at one point, checking for structural issues, and then in the barn, and then the sound of a shovel starting to work on the drifts that had piled against the cabin door. She finished her coffee and pulled on her coat and went out to help, taking the second shovel from the barn, and they worked in the cold, clear air without talking for the better part of 2 hours. The valley they uncovered, shovel by shovel, was changed. The storm had rearranged things, drifts that altered the familiar landscape, trees weighted with snow in configurations she hadn't seen before, the track to the road buried under 3 feet of fresh accumulation. It would take days to get through to the neighbors. The valley was more isolated now than it had been at any point in the winter. And yet, standing in the yard in the aftermath of the worst storm of the season, breathing air that stung her lungs and watching Silas work the shovel with his methodical, unhurried rhythm, she found she was not afraid. She'd been afraid in the first weeks of exactly this, of the isolation, of the weight of winter, of being cut off from everything familiar with a stranger. And now the worst had come, and what she felt instead of fear was something she didn't have a clean name for. Not peace, exactly. More like the particular steadiness of a person who has discovered what she's capable of and found it's more than she thought. That evening, she sat with the book in her lap again and actually read it this time. And Silas sat across from her with his work, and the fire burned between them, and the silence was the kind that didn't need filling. The kind that 2 people arrive at only after they've been through enough together that quiet stops feeling like distance. She was aware in a way she hadn't been before of the specific quality of his presence across the room. Not just that he was there, but how he was there. The way he held himself, the particular angle of his attention when he worked, the shape of his profile in the firelight. She was aware of this, and she let herself be aware of it, which was new. She'd been managing that awareness for weeks, keeping it at arm's length, putting it in the category of observation she wasn't ready to act on. She was still not ready to act on it. But she stopped arguing with herself about whether she was allowed to feel it. He looked up once, briefly, and found her looking at him. She didn't look away. He held her gaze for a second with that unreadable expression. Not quite blank, not quite warm, something in between that she'd gotten better at interpreting. And then he looked back at his work. Her heart was beating faster than it had any particular reason to. She looked back at her book and read the same sentence 3 times and did not retain a single word of it, and she thought that something had shifted again in the room. But this time the shift was inside her rather than between them, and that was going to require some time to settle. Outside, the snow that had fallen for 4 days lay still and deep over everything, and the valley was quiet the way it only was after a storm, and the cabin held its warmth against the cold, and Evelyn sat in the firelight with a book she wasn't reading and began, for the first time, to understand what it might mean to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and simply let herself be where she was. It was not a comfortable realization. It was not a sudden or dramatic one. It was the quiet, inconvenient, slightly terrifying realization that she had stopped wanting to be somewhere else. She closed the book on her thumb and stared at the fire and thought, well, here we are then. The fire popped. Silas turned a piece of leather over in his hands and said nothing, and the wind outside had gone somewhere else for the night, and the winter that had seemed like a sentence when it started was almost half over, and she was still here, and She searched herself for the right word and couldn't find one that wasn't terrifying in its honesty. She was grateful, not for the circumstances that had brought her here, not for the arrangement or the lack of choice, or any of the things that had cost her, but for what had grown in the space those things created, without asking her permission, without caring whether she was ready. The knowledge of a man who kept his word, who split wood for other people's fires, who told her the truth about hard winters and didn't soften it, who gave her a worn book at Christmas and called her father good, and fixed the chinking in the dark with red hands and never, not once, made her feel like she owed him anything for any of it. She was grateful for that. She was still figuring out what to do with it. The night settled around the cabin and the fire burned down, and Silas banked it for the night and said goodnight to her in his plain, careful way. And she said goodnight back, and she went to the bedroom and lay in the dark and listened to the silence that was no longer frightening. Sleep came easier than it had in months. The days after the big storm had a quality of aftermath to them. A bruised stillness, like the valley itself was taking stock of what had just happened. The snow lay so deep in places that the familiar landmarks changed, fence posts buried to their caps, the creek bend invisible under a flat white expanse that gave no hint of what moved beneath it. Silas spent 3 days digging out the track to the road and reinforcing the barn wall that had taken the worst of the wind, and Evelyn spent those same days working through the cabin with a systematic attention that was partly practical and partly the thing she did when she had too much feeling and not enough outlet for it. She reorganized the food stores, updated the inventory notebook in handwriting that was neater than Silas's cramped script, and added her own notations in the margins. small observations about consumption rates and what they'd need to restock in spring. She mended 3 shirts and a pair of work trousers that had been sitting in the basket since December, waiting for someone to get to them. She made a batch of hard tallow candles because they were running lower than she liked, and the process was unpleasant and time-consuming and left the cabin smelling for hours. But at the end of it, they had 24 candles on the shelf, and that was a fact she could feel good about. What she was doing, she understood, was managing the distance between what she now knew about herself and what she was ready to do with that knowledge. Keeping busy was how she'd always handled the gap between knowing and acting. Her father had the same habit. When something was unresolved in his mind, he found wood that needed splitting or a fence that needed mending, and he worked until either the resolution came or he was too tired to keep turning the problem over. She was turning it over. She just hadn't arrived anywhere yet. What changed things, or began to, was not a single moment but a sequence of small ones that accumulated until they had weight. The first was a Thursday afternoon, about a week after the storm. Silas came in from outside earlier than usual, moving differently than his normal, unhurried way. She looked up from the candle molds and saw it, in how he was holding his left arm. What happened? Barn wall. He sat down in the chair by the fire and peeled off his coat, one-armed, which told her it was worse than he was going to say. Beam gave when I was repositioning it. Got my shoulder. She set down what she was doing and crossed the room. Let me see. It's fine. Silas? She stood in front of him. Let me see. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man weighing the options and finding them limited. Then he pulled his shirt collar aside enough for her to see the shoulder. It was not fine. The bruising was already coming up, dark and extensive, and when she put careful fingers to the joint, he made a sound he was clearly trying not to make. Nothing's broken, she said, more to organize her own thinking than to reassure him. But you've done something to the joint. You can't use it for a few days. I need to use it. Not without making it worse. She went to find the cloth strips and the small crock of liniment that Ruth Henderson had pressed on her in November with the comment that it would be needed eventually. The barn wall will wait. You won't be useful to anyone if you push this and tear something properly. He said nothing. She took his silence as non-objection, which was the closest she was going to get, and began working on the shoulder with the systematic competence of a woman who had patched up her father's various injuries over the years. She worked carefully, applying the liniment and then binding the joint with enough support to limit movement without cutting circulation. He sat still and let her do it, which cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the deliberate quality of his stillness. He was a man who did not easily become the patient. She'd already known that. She'd just never been this close to the specific texture of it. Done, she said, tying off the binding. She was close enough that she could see the angle of his jaw and the line of his collar and the way his breathing had evened out as the liniment started to work. Thank you, he said. His voice was quieter than usual. She didn't move away immediately. There was a moment, 2 or 3 seconds, where she was close and he was looking up at her and the fire was behind her, and neither of them said anything. Then she stepped back and went to wash the liniment off her hands. You'll need to let me check it tomorrow, she said, over her shoulder. All right, he said. She kept her face turned to the basin until she was sure the warmth in her face had settled. He was limited for 4 days, not helpless. He worked around the injury with the same methodical problem-solving he brought to everything, finding ways to do what needed doing with one functional arm and one that he could use for light support only. But there were things he simply couldn't manage, and she took them without making a point of it. She split the firewood. She did the barn work. She brought in the water and did the heavier lifting around the cabin. He didn't thank her every time. She appreciated that. Constant gratitude would have felt like scorekeeping, and they were past scorekeeping. On the second evening of his limited capacity, she came in from the barn to find him at the table. He'd been writing something. She saw the paper and the pen before he set them aside. His face had the same look she'd caught once before, months ago, the one that appeared when he thought he was alone. Something private and unguarded, living briefly on the surface. What were you writing? She asked. She didn't normally ask about his private business, but something about the evening, the lamplight, the softness the injury had introduced into his usual self-sufficiency, made the question feel possible. He glanced at the paper. Letter to Catherine's mother, in Ohio. He paused. I write her twice a year. She's old. She liked hearing about the valley. Evelyn pulled off her coat and hung it up. You've been doing that since Catherine died? Since before. Catherine started it, so I kept it up. He folded the letter and set it aside. Felt wrong to stop. She sat down at the table. She didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that needed to be said, and filling that silence would have made it smaller. She just sat with it, with the image of a man alone in a cabin writing twice-yearly letters to his dead wife's mother because it felt wrong to stop. She must be glad of it, Evelyn said finally. She wrote back for the first year, then her handwriting got too bad. He looked at the folded letter. I still write. She looked at him and felt something that was specific and whole rather than the complicated mixed signal feeling she'd been carrying for months. It was not pity. Nothing about it was condescending. It was closer to recognition. The recognition of a person who does the private, unnecessary thing because it's the right thing, with no audience and no credit for it. You're a good man, Silas, she said. She'd said it once before, in the wagon with her father's voice in her head. This time it landed differently, because this time she meant it not as an assessment, but as something she was offering directly to him. He looked at her. His face did the thing she'd come to watch for. The barely there adjustment, the slight softening of whatever he kept at the surface. I try, he said. Not deflecting, just honest. She nodded. And then she got up and started supper, because that was what the evening needed next. And some things are better left at the place where they land rather than picked up and examined until they fall apart. The shoulder healed. The track cleared. The valley emerged from the worst of the winter into the long, exhausted tail of it. The stretch of February and early March that everyone who'd survived it knew was the most deceptive part, where the cold was still dangerous, but a certain winter weariness made you careless. People made mistakes in March that they wouldn't have made in December, and Evelyn watched for it in herself and in Silas and in everyone they had contact with. She was at the Hendersons one afternoon when Ruth said something that she turned over for the rest of the day. They'd been talking about the valley, about who had made it through well and who'd had a hard go of it, and Ruth had said, with the matter-of-fact directness that Evelyn had come to depend on, "You two did well, better than I expected, if I'm honest." "Better than you expected?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Ruth poured coffee without looking up. "Arranged marriages are hard, Evelyn. Most of them I've seen out here are hard. People settle for a kind of armed truce and call it a life." She set down the pot. "You two aren't doing that." Evelyn wrapped both hands around her cup. "What are we doing?" Ruth looked at her with the particular patience of a woman who'd been watching people navigate themselves for longer than most. "I think you're figuring that out," she said. "That's different from settling." She drove home in the late afternoon with Ruth's words sitting in the passenger seat beside her, heavy and specific in the way of true things. She and Silas had supper that night and talked about the things they usually talked about. The supplies, the animals, a fence section that needed attention come spring, a letter from Dutch that had arrived with the Henderson boy the previous week, written in the cramped, proud handwriting of a man who'd survived another winter alone and wanted someone to know it. The conversation was easy in the way their conversations had become easy. The fluency of people who'd learned each other's shorthand, who no longer needed to translate. After supper, she sat with her book and he sat with a piece of carving he'd started in January and set aside. A small thing she'd been curious about but hadn't asked. She looked at it now. "What is that?" He turned it in his hands. "Box. For the medicine shelf." He ran his thumb along the edge. "The jars keep getting knocked over." She looked at it more closely. He'd put detail into it. Small, careful cuts along the edge that weren't necessary for a functional box, but were there anyway. She thought about him doing that work by lamplight in the evenings, adding detail to something that didn't strictly require it. "It's nice," she said. He looked up. "You sound surprised." "I didn't know you carved." "Catherine taught me." He said it without the weight it might have had earlier in the winter. Not lightly either, just straightforwardly, the way you can eventually talk about something when you've carried it long enough to understand its shape. She was better at it. "Can I see?" He handed it across. She turned it in her hands, feeling the careful cuts, the smooth sides, the deliberate care of it. It was not a perfect object. The proportions were slightly uneven on one side in a way that you had to look for, but that was there. It was the imperfection of a person who was genuinely trying, rather than someone performing skill. She handed it back. "It's good work," she said. He took it and looked at it for a moment. "It'll do," he said, with the tone of a man who saw the uneven side and had made peace with it. She went back to her book. The fire ticked. The carved box sat on the table between them, imperfect and solid and real. The moment she'd been trying to understand since the night after the storm arrived, finally, on a night in mid-March when the temperature had dropped again after a false promise of warmth, and she woke in the bedroom to the sound of Silas coughing. It was not the violent, alarmed coughing of illness. It was the low, controlled coughing of a man trying not to make noise, which was worse because it meant he'd been doing it for a while and was managing it rather than letting it disrupt anything. She lay in the dark and listened and counted. It came in intervals, and between intervals she could hear his breathing, which had the quality of something working harder than it should be. She got up. He was on the pallet near the far wall, wrapped in blankets, facing away from the fire because the light had burned down. When she came in, he heard her and went still. "Go back to bed," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "How long have you been coughing?" "Couple hours." A pause. "It'll pass." She stood in the cold of the main room in her wool socks and her heavy nightgown and looked at him on the floor, wrapped in inadequate blankets, managing a chest cough alone in the dark because he didn't want to wake her. She thought about the shoulder injury and the way he'd tried to say it was fine. She thought about the letters to Catherine's mother, twice a year, with no one to know he was writing them. She thought about the wood he split for other people's fires and the supplies in other people's saddlebags, and every single thing he'd done since October that he'd done without asking for anything in return, including rest, including warmth, including the basic consideration of not spending winter on a pallet on the floor of his own house. Something settled in her chest. Not a dramatic settling, not a wave or a rush, more like the final piece of something clicking into place after you'd been trying to fit it for a long time and finally got the angle right. "Get up," she said. He turned over and looked at her. The firelight was low but enough to see his face. The tiredness in it, the roughness of someone who'd been coughing in the dark for 2 hours. And underneath it the familiar guarded expression, waiting to understand what she meant. "Evelyn, get up, Silas." Her voice was steady. She'd made her decision. "You're sleeping in the bed tonight." He was quiet for a long moment. It's a bed. It fits 2 people and we're both adults." She held his gaze in the low light. She needed him to understand that she wasn't offering this from pity or obligation or any of the other things he might reach for to make it smaller than it was. "You've been on that floor since October. You have a cough. It's 15 degrees outside, and you've been lying in this room away from the fire." She paused. "Come to bed." The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he was going to refuse, and she was already preparing herself for that, for how to let him decline without making it strange between them. But then he sat up. He got to his feet. He was moving carefully, the way you move when you're stiff and cold and don't want to let on how stiff and cold you are. She went back to the bedroom and pulled back the quilts on the far side of the bed and got in on her side. She heard him in the main room, the sound of him banking the fire properly, adjusting something, and she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Her heart was going. She was not going to pretend it wasn't. He came in. He moved to the far side of the bed and got in with the careful economy of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. The bed shifted under his weight. The cold he carried in from the main room reached her briefly, and then the warmth of the quilt started to do what warmth does. The silence was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. "Thank you," he said finally, low, in the dark. "Stop thanking me," she said. Her voice came out softer than she'd intended. A pause, then, "All right." She stared at the ceiling. She was aware of every inch of the distance between them. The deliberate, careful distance of 2 people being scrupulously respectful of a line they hadn't crossed yet. She was also aware that the line had shifted, that the decision to walk up to it and stand there together was its own kind of crossing. His coughing eased. She didn't know if it was the warmth or the fact that he'd stopped trying to manage it silently and could just breathe. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it eased. She heard his breathing slow, deepen. He was asleep before her. She lay awake a while longer. The fire in the main room ticked quietly down. The wind outside was at a low register, not the vicious thing it had been all winter. In the morning there would be work. There was always work. And she would get up first, probably, because she'd started doing that without deciding to. And she'd start the fire, and he would hear it and wake up, and they would move through the morning in the way they'd learned to move, without collision, without ceremony, just the ordinary, extraordinary fact of two people sharing a life. She turned her head in the dark and looked at the shape of him beside her, the rise and fall of him under the quilts, the fact of his presence in this space that had been hers alone, and she thought about what Ruth Henderson had said. You're figuring it out. That's different from settling. She was figuring it out. She didn't have the words for what she'd figured out yet. Or rather, she had the words, but they frightened her with their weight. She was going to need a little more time to carry them up to her mouth and say them out loud. But she was going to say them. She knew that now. She closed her eyes. Outside, the winter that had defined the last 5 months was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The days already a fraction longer than they'd been at the deepest point. The light at the edge of the afternoon lasting a few minutes further toward evening. Nobody in the valley was celebrating yet. Everybody who'd lived there long enough knew not to celebrate early. But it was there, the turn, in the angle of the light, and the texture of the cold, and those who were paying attention could feel it. Evelyn was paying attention. She'd been paying attention to this valley all winter, and to the man beside her, and to the slow, inconvenient, entirely unasked-for truth of what she was becoming here. She felt it now the way she felt the seasons turn, not in any single dramatic signal, but in the accumulated, undeniable weight of small things pointing the same direction. She slept. Spring in the Montana Valley did not arrive the way people in softer climates imagined it. It did not announce itself with warmth and birdsong and a general loosening of everything that had been held tight. It arrived as argument, cold mornings still biting hard, afternoons that briefly convinced you winter was done, then evenings that reminded you it wasn't. The snow retreated grudgingly, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving the north sides white and stubborn for weeks longer. The creek, when it finally broke free, did it loudly, running fast and brown and carrying everything the winter had deposited on its banks. Evelyn watched the season change, from the cabin window, and from the yard, and from the track between their land and the Hendersons, and she felt it happening inside herself in the same incremental, uneven way. Not a transformation, more like a thaw, the slow giving way of something that had been held frozen, releasing not all at once but in stages, each one a little further than the last. The morning after she'd told Silas to come to bed, they'd both been careful with each other in the way of people navigating new geography without a map. Not awkward exactly. They'd been past awkward for a while, but attentive, watching where they stepped. She'd gotten up first and started the fire, and when he came out, he'd said good morning in his usual way, nothing different in his voice, and she'd handed him coffee, and that had been that. No discussion of it, no performance of significance. They were both, she understood, people who processed things internally before they could offer them outward, and they were both willing to give the other the time to do that. His cough cleared in 3 days. He didn't go back to the pallet. Neither of them said anything about it. It just stopped being a question. She thought later that this was one of the things she'd come to value most about Silas Boone. The way he didn't force conversations that didn't need forcing. Some things could be established without a formal declaration, and he understood that. He'd understood it from the beginning, actually, from the moment he told her the cabin was cold and the winter was brutal, and he wasn't going to lie about it. He'd always known the difference between the things that needed saying and the things that could simply be lived. March moved into April with its particular brand of reluctant beauty. The horses grew restless in the barn, wanting pasture that wasn't quite ready for them yet. The woodpile, which had seemed enormous in October and terrifying in January, was now down to its last quarter, and that was fine because the worst was over, and what remained would carry them through. She looked at the depleted stack one morning and felt something she recognized as pride. Not in herself alone, not in Silas alone, but in the fact of them having gotten through it together. The woodpile was a record of the winter. Every missing log was a cold night survived. She was standing there counting logs in her head, which she recognized was a slightly absurd thing to do, when Silas came up behind her and stood looking at the same thing. "We made it," she said. "We did." He was quiet for a moment. You did. This is your first full winter out here. It's your house. Was, he said. Just the one word. Not a declaration, just a correction. A small factual amendment that carried everything inside it. She turned and looked at him. The morning light was the April kind, still thin, but with a quality to it that December light entirely lacked, a suggestion of what was coming. His face in that light looked like the face of a man who is tired in the good way that comes from having done necessary work, rather than the bad way that comes from having done pointless damage to yourself. Silas, she said. Yeah, I want to stay. She held his gaze. Not because I have to. Not because the pass is closed or my father made an arrangement or because I don't have anywhere else to go. She'd been working out how to say this for 2 months and had decided the only way was plainly, which was the only way anything between them had ever worked. I want to stay because this is where I want to be. Because of you. I need you to know the difference. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him receiving it. Not with surprise exactly, but with the careful attention of a man who doesn't take things for granted and is making sure he understands what he's being given. I know the difference, he said. His voice was quiet and direct. I've been hoping you'd get there. Didn't want to push. You never push. Doesn't mean I don't want things. She looked at him. What do you want? He held her gaze. This, he said, what we've got, to keep building it. It was not a romantic speech. It was Silas, plain and careful and meaning every word without ornament. She'd stopped needing the ornament somewhere around January. All right, she said. He nodded. And then, because he was Silas, he looked back at the woodpile and said, We'll need to restock before next October. She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it. A real laugh, unguarded and slightly surprised at itself. He looked at her sideways with the full version of the almost smile, the one she'd been collecting glimpses of all winter and now finally saw complete, and it made something in her chest do a thing she was going to have to get accustomed to. I know, she said. I'll help. They went inside for breakfast. The wedding, the real one, the one that was theirs rather than the one that had been the arrangement, was Evelyn's idea, and she brought it up in early May when the pass had opened and the valley was beginning to look like itself again. She'd been thinking about it since March. She was not a woman who needed ceremony for its own sake, but she'd come to understand that there was a difference between the words she'd said in her father's sitting room in October, in her best wool skirt with the minister hurrying to get back before the weather turned, and the words she could say now. She wanted to say them now. She raised it one evening after supper, plainly, the way she'd learned to raise things between them. I want to do the ceremony again, she said. Silas looked up from the carved box on the table. He'd been adding a final detail to it, a small thing along the back edge. The wedding? Yes. He turned the box in his hands. You don't feel... He paused, choosing his words. What we said in October still counts. I know it counts. I want to say it again when I mean it the way I mean it now. She looked at him. Is that strange? He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't dismiss it or capitulate immediately. He actually considered it. No, he said after a moment. It's not strange. I want my father there, and the Hendersons, and the Praters, if Anna can bring James out. She paused. Dutch, if he'll come down from that hill, which he probably won't. The corner of Silas's mouth moved. He'll come. He complained about missing the first one. She blinked. He knew about our wedding? He knows everything that happens in this valley. He just pretends he doesn't, so people will leave him alone. She filed that information away for future reference. Will you do it? She asked. Say the words again, knowing what we know now. He looked at her steadily. Yeah, Evelyn, he said. I'll do that. They drove to Cedar Fork 3 days later to get her father, and Evelyn sat beside Silas on the wagon seat and watched the valley open up around them as they came down from their end of it. The creek running clear now, the slopes green where they'd been white, the sky a particular deep blue that only appeared in May when the air finally gave up pretending winter might return. She had been looking at this valley for 7 months and seeing it more clearly with every month that passed. The way you look at something long enough that you stop seeing what you expected and start seeing what's actually there. Her father cried when she told him. He turned away to do it, the way he always turned away. And she let him, and when he turned back, she was looking out the window. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. Did you know? She turned. When you made the arrangement with Silas, did you know what kind of man he was, or were you just hoping? Thomas Carter was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through his window and made him look his age, which was the kind of light she'd gotten used to and had stopped being able to ignore. He was thinner than he'd been in October. There were things about his health that she was not yet ready to fully look at, though she was going to have to look at them soon. I knew enough, he said. I'd watched him in this valley for 3 years. The way he treated his neighbors, his animals, the way he handled himself when things went bad. He paused. I didn't know exactly. I knew enough to believe it was possible. You gambled. Yes. He didn't try to dress it up. On both of you. She held that. Held the image of her father looking at the winter coming and looking at his own fading body and doing the arithmetic and choosing Silas Boone not out of convenience but out of his own careful, imperfect judgment, choosing him for her. You were right, she said. He nodded. He didn't say I know, which would have been insufferable, or thank you, which would have been wrong. He just nodded, and she reached over and put her hand on his arm for a moment, and then went to see what Silas was doing in the yard. The ceremony took place on a Saturday in mid-May, in the yard of the Henderson property, which was the largest cleared space in that end of the valley, and the place the community used for events that needed gathering room. Ruth Henderson had apparently been planning for this since March, which was how Evelyn understood that people had seen what she was taking longer to see herself. The yard had the modest decorations that May and Montana allowed. Early wildflowers in jars, a table with food that every family had contributed something to, the Prater children chasing each other around the far fence. Dutch came down from his hill. He wore his good coat, which had seen better decades, and he stood at the edge of the gathering with his arms crossed and his expression suggesting that he was only here because he happened to be passing and had nothing better to do, which was entirely false, and everybody knew it. James Prater, 8 months old and recently recovered from his winter of illness, sat in Anna's arms and watched everything with the serious attention of a person who has decided the world is interesting. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw and a full winter's worth of being fought for behind him. Meg Henderson cried during the ceremony, which she later hotly denied. The minister from Cedar Fork read from his book, the same words as October, but this time he wasn't in a hurry to get back before the weather turned. He read them at a human pace. And this time Evelyn said them looking at Silas, not at the wall behind him, and she said them meaning what they said in the full weight of that meaning, without reservation and without the performance of courage she'd needed in October. When it was Silas's turn, he said the words in his careful, unhurried way, choosing each one the way he always chose each word, because to him words were tools, and you used them accurately or you didn't use them at all. She watched his face while he said them. It was the most open she'd ever seen him look, and that was not dramatically open. It was Silas. It was always going to be a subtle thing, but it was real, and it was fully present, and it was for her. You may, the minister started. She kissed him first. She'd been the one to say, come to bed. She'd been the one to say, I want to stay and mean it as a choice, and she was the one who closed the distance now because some things you decide and then you do them. He was surprised for half a second, and then he wasn't, and his hand came up to the side of her face with a carefulness that was also its own kind of declaration. Behind them, Ruth Henderson made a sound of satisfaction. Dutch made a sound of protest that was actually satisfaction in a different coat. The Prater children didn't notice because they were still chasing each other around the fence. Her father watched from his chair. They'd brought a chair out for him because the standing was hard on him now. And he had the expression of a man whose most important piece of work had turned out better than he'd dared to calculate. The afternoon went on the way good afternoons do, without anyone particularly directing it. Food appeared and disappeared. Carl Henderson and Silas stood to one side talking about fence line repair with the focused attention of men who find it easier to be happy when they're also being practical. Evelyn sat with Anna Prater for a while and held James, who regarded her with the serious eyes of an infant who has been through a hard winter and emerged with opinions about the world. And she thought about the November night when he'd been burning up in that little bed and all the nights since. He's grown, she said. Completely different baby than he was in October, Anna said. Bigger and louder, and has taken a position on everything. Sounds like someone raised him right. Anna looked at her. You helped save him. I haven't said that enough. You said it. I should keep saying it. Anna took James back and settled him on her hip. That's what we do out here, isn't it? We keep saying the things that matter. Evelyn thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She found her father alone later, when the gathering had softened into the easy diffusion of an event that had done what it came to do. He was sitting in his chair watching the valley with the expression of a man conducting a private inventory. She sat on the ground beside his chair, the way she'd sat beside him as a child when they'd watched the summer evenings come in. The grass was still the new green of early May, and the air smelled of it. You need to come and live with us, she said. He was quiet. Before next winter, she said. I'm not asking, I'm telling you. We'll add a room, or we'll figure something else out, but you're not going through another winter alone in Cedar Fork. Evelyn, I know you don't want to be a burden. She looked up at him. You're not a burden. You're my father. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. The stubbornness in his face was real. He'd passed it down to her. It was the family currency. But underneath it was the particular tiredness of a man who has been fighting a reasonable thing for no good reason and knows it. Silas won't mind, he said. Silas suggested it in February. Her father's expression shifted, something that was almost humor moving through the tiredness. Did he? He didn't tell me. I found out from Ruth. She paused. That's how he operates. Her father nodded slowly. I'll come, he said, before the pass closes. Good. She put her hand on his. Good. They sat there in the May afternoon, and the valley lay around them, green and complicated and full of the people who'd made it through the winter together. And she thought about what Anna had said. The things that matter. You keep saying them. She thought about everything the winter had taught her, which was more than she'd wanted to learn and more than she could have managed alone. It had taught her that isolation doesn't have to mean loneliness, that strength is not always loud, and that trust is not one moment of decision, but 1,000 small ones accumulated into something that holds weight. It had taught her that you could know someone the way you know weather, not by being told about them, but by being in the same place when things go bad and watching what they do. And it had taught her that the bravest thing she'd done in a winter full of hard choices was not any of the practical survivals, but the choice to stay open, to keep revising her map, to let a person surprise her. She was not, she knew, finished being surprised by Silas Boone. She suspected she had years of it ahead of her, and the surprises would not all be gentle ones, because that was people. They had difficult interiors and inconvenient moments, and the slow negotiation of a shared life was never fully completed. You just kept working at it. She knew that. She'd gone in expecting a battle and gotten a partnership instead, and she understood now that a partnership was not the easier thing. It demanded more, actually. It demanded you show up honestly and keep showing up. She was going to do that. On the drive home that evening, with the light going gold across the valley and her father asleep on the wagon bench between them, his head tilting toward her shoulder, Silas reached across and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand over hers, warm and rough and certain. She turned her palm up and held it. They drove through the early evening in the easy silence of people who had run out of things to prove to each other, which is its own kind of arrival. Not a destination you plan for, but one you notice, one day, that you've reached. The valley was green on both sides, and the creek ran somewhere below them, and the pass behind Cedar Fork stood open against the sky, its snow not fully gone but giving way. The season doing the slow and irreversible thing that seasons do. A year later, when the second winter came, and it came hard, the way Montana winters always did, with no apology and no accommodation for anyone's plans. The cabin at the valley's edge had a different character than it had had the winter before. Thomas Carter was in the new room off the back, which was small but warm and positioned close to the main fireplace, and he had taken over the inventory notebook with the focused energy of a man who'd been given useful work and understood its value. The woodpile was larger than it had ever been, because 4 people preparing for a winter prepared differently than 2. Dutch came down from his hill every 2 weeks now, nominally to borrow tools, actually because he'd discovered that Thomas Carter played a decent game of cards and was willing to lose without making it strange. And Evelyn was expecting a child. She told Silas on a November morning, standing in the yard in the cold, because she'd found out the afternoon before and had spent the night turning the information over, and she needed to say it out loud in the plain air between them where it could become real. He went still in the particular way he went still when something had reached him past his usual surface. She watched his face move through things. The surprise, and then something she recognized as the same fear any person feels when something they want suddenly becomes real and therefore possible to lose. And then underneath it, in the slow settling of his features, something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but something in between that was realer than either. "Yeah?" he said. "Yeah." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and pulled her forward by her coat collar and held her, which was the most demonstrative she'd ever seen him be. And she put her arms around him and they stood in the cold November yard like that, which was ridiculous and also exactly right. "We'll need more firewood," he said, into the top of her head. She laughed, muffled against his coat. "We have plenty of firewood." "More," he said firmly. The baby arrived in late June, in the full warmth of the mountain summer, which was the best possible timing and had been arrived at with absolutely no planning whatsoever. It was a daughter. She had Evelyn's jaw and Silas's eyes and a voice, when she decided to use it, that carried across the entire cabin without any apparent effort. Ruth Henderson held her and said, "This one's going to give you trouble." "Good," Evelyn said. Thomas Carter held his granddaughter with the hands that trembled now on cold mornings and were steady as anything on warm ones, and looked at her face for a long time without saying anything. And Evelyn watched him do it and thought about the arithmetic he'd done 3 years ago, the terrible calculation of a man who loved his daughter and couldn't protect her the old way and chose a different way instead. Right or wrong, frightened or certain, he'd done it and she was here. And the baby in his arms was here. And the valley was alive around them with the people who'd made it through the bad winters together. "What's her name?" Ruth asked. Evelyn looked at Silas across the room. They'd talked about this. They'd had the conversation that all parents have, the back and forth of names that mean different things to different people, the gentle arguing, the compromise. "May," Silas said. Not for anyone in the room, just for the name, which had belonged to a woman who'd never gotten her summer and now belonged to a child who'd been born into the warmth. Anna Prater, standing at the back of the room with little James on her hip, heard it and put her hand over her mouth briefly and then composed herself. Some things you understood if you'd been through the winter together, and you didn't need them explained. The name sat in the room, and it was right. There is a particular kind of story that doesn't announce its meaning as it's happening, that lives in the small, unglamorous accumulation of a life being built by people who are imperfect and scared and stubborn and trying. It doesn't have a moment where everything becomes clear. It has instead a series of mornings where you get up and do the thing, and a series of evenings where you sit across from the person you chose, or who was chosen for you before you had the wisdom to choose, and find that the distance between you has shortened again by some small amount that you couldn't have measured but can feel. Evelyn had come to this valley with no map and no choice, and a stubbornness she intended as armor. She'd found instead that the armor was less useful than the stubbornness, that the capacity to stay open, to keep revising what she knew, to let the evidence of a man's character reach her past her fear, was the thing that had made everything else possible. Not a gift she'd been given, a choice she'd kept making. And Silas had found, in a cabin that had been too quiet for too long, that the thing he'd stopped believing was available. A life that was genuinely shared, built on the plain foundation of honesty and mutual labor, had come to him through his neighbor's arithmetic and an October wagon ride and a 20-year-old woman who gave nothing away for free and meant everything she said. They were not a love story in the way of songs or parlor novels. They were something less elegant and more durable. They were two people who had looked at each other clearly, in bad weather and in good, and kept choosing the same direction. The summer went on. May Boone grew, loudly and with opinions. The valley held its people in their separate cabins, connected by 3 miles of track and decades of accumulated obligation and the knowledge that the next winter was already coming, the way it always was, and that they would face it the same way they'd faced all the others, together, imperfectly, and without giving up. That was enough. It was, in fact, everything.